Last week, we talked about bus boycotts and sit-ins. This week, we'll be looking at freedom rides in the early 60s. The height of the freedom rides didn't really take place until the early 1960s because back in the 1950s, there's a threat of nuclear holocaust, making it an inopportune time for social movements. Also because during the late 1950s, there were freedom movements going on in Africa that inspired black people in America to protest for their freedoms. The first look of the freedom rides was the Journey of Reconciliation, which took place in 1947. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation on interstate buses and trains is unconstitutional. Members from CORE tried to test out the Supreme Court's decision, but had an unsuccessful ride as they were arrested in North Carolina. Jumping forward to 1961, the Freedom Riders used a nonviolent resistance approach that Gandhi used in India. Freedom Riders planned to depart from Washington, D.C. and travel through Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and then ended in New Orleans. However, the Freedom Riders divided into two groups. The first group stopped in Anniston, Alabama, which these riders were stoned, the tires were slashed, and the firebomb was thrown into the bus. The other group stopped in Birmingham, where a mob waited for them so that they could attack. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference chose to demonstrate in Birmingham because they knew with Bull Connor there as the Commissioner of Public Safety that there would be violence. The need for violence was necessary because without violence the media would become bored and there would be no government intervention. When Bull Connor was reelected as Public Safety Commissioner, he won by a landslide because he said anytime that the Freedom Riders ride into town, the KKK can have 15 minutes of open season before any intervention. Bull Connor also stated that the police wasn't at the Freedom Ride with the bombs and the mob because it was Mother's Day. However, he planned for the city police to stay away so that he could attack, or so that the people could attack the Freedom Riders. After these attacks made national news, Robert Kennedy tried to call Governor Patterson, the governor of Alabama, to talk about the situation. However, he didn't answer, which gave Robert Kennedy even more motive to enforce the Supreme Court decision. After Robert Kennedy expressed his authority to enforce this law, Patterson finally answered the call and agreed only with Justice Department aide John Seigenthaler because he was a Southerner. After meeting with Seigenthaler, Patterson promised safe travels to the Freedom Riders, but he lied. A week later, a group traveled from Birmingham to Montgomery as they were promised safety by a private plane, state patrol cars, and 2 Greyhound officers. However, when the Freedom Riders made it into Montgomery, all of that protection mysteriously disappeared and the mob awaited for them arrival to beat them up. John Seigenthaler was falling behind and tried to break up the mob, but was knocked unconscious for trying to help the Freedom Riders. Robert Kennedy now believed it was justified for federal troops to come in. After hearing about the Freedom Riders being attacked, Martin Luther King Jr. flew into Montgomery. Martin Luther King Jr. had a rally to support the Freedom Riders in a church that was protected by federal marshals. During the night, whites came to the church to threaten the blacks inside by throwing bottles at the federal marshals. The federal marshals, in turn, threw back tear gas. Kennedy called Patterson, who ordered martial law, and had the crowd dispersed and had the federal marshals escort the people in the church out. The Freedom Riders eventually were allowed to travel in the South peacefully. Once the Freedom Riders made it into Mississippi, they were arrested, however. Robert Kennedy made an agreement that if there were no mobs waiting for the Freedom Riders in Mississippi, then he will not enforce the federal law. Robert Kennedy pushed for voter registration because he was torn about helping the blacks out, actually, and upsetting the Southern Democrats. However, in Mississippi in 1962, at the University of Mississippi, there were 2 people killed in a desegregation riot. Barnett, who was the governor of Mississippi at the time, had an extreme segregation platform with defiant speech as to integration of schools. So the battle of integration continues. In 1963, the SCLC brought the nonviolent resistance back to Birmingham because he knew that Bull Connor was there. This made national news because Bull Connor actually unleashed police dogs and water hoses on women and children. After this incident, 52% of Americans viewed civil rights as the most urgent issue, as only 4% before. After President Kennedy died, Johnson strongly backed his civil rights bill and ended up passing it in 1964.